First days were the hardest. The order has been issued. Prepare the sandbags. For some reason, the local authorities could not immediately organize a sufficient number of people who would prepare the sandbags. After this was done, the role of helicopter pilots included only one operation: to deliver the sandbags and drop them at the designated places. With my own eyes, I saw how the crew commanders and officers loaded the sandbags, attached them to the helicopters, flew to the target, dropped them, returned, and then did it all over again. So on the 27th and the 28th of April, neither the Ministry of Energy nor the local authorities could fully and precisely organize the work to supply materials that had to be dropped into the center of the reactor. Around the 29th, a system for this was put in place. Quarries were prepared, the lead started to come in, people were assigned to stations, and then things went smoother. Around this time, the helicopter pilots found a very effective way of operating by setting up an observation post on the roof of the Pripyat Party Committee building. From there, they monitored the crews that were above the fourth block. I must say that this work was not safe because the pilot had to hover above the reactor, drop a considerably large load precisely on the target, and then leave as quickly as possible, not to get an excessive dose of radiation. All this was well coordinated, and if memory serves me well, then the numbers were as follows. Tens of tons were dropped on the first day, then hundreds on the second and third day, and eventually Major Antoshkin reported to us in the Government Commission's meeting that on that day they had dropped 1,100 tons of materials. All in all, this quick and diligent work of the people that were delivering the materials resulted in the reactor being clogged around the 2nd of May. From that day on, the generation of radionuclides of any considerable amount from the crater reduced. Simultaneously, the military continued to do all the necessary reconnaissance operations. The work of the Government Commission during the first days was as follows. Early in the morning, Boris Urbina would gather for a meeting with all the members and people responsible for the various operations. The meeting usually began with a General Pekalov's report, presenting the radiation conditions within the station and the surrounding areas. Of course, the conditions were worsening every day. The already scouted areas were showing higher radiation levels, and the number of such areas was increasing. The number was increasing because the scouts were visiting more and more new areas, while the old areas were receiving more and more radionuclide fallout. Overall, the situation was getting so complicated that it became clear that the scale of this operation had to be increased. The first decontamination efforts began even while the conglomeration processes inside the fourth block were ongoing. But what did they boil down to? I remember that the future Minister of Medium Machine Building, Comrade Ryabev, who had replaced Meshkov in the Government Commission, himself led the group after receiving the recipe for preparing the compounds that could solidify and create polymeric films on the surface. He organized a team in one of the industrial areas of Pripyat that would prepare these solutions. They then themselves went to the most contaminated areas and covered them with these solutions. At the same time, the group that I had called, led by Comrade Alexander Fyodorovich from our institute, was researching ways to inject these compounds into the soil in order to absorb the most mobile radionuclides, cesium being one of them. Then the phosphate compounds appeared. A group of scientists from Novosibirsk telegraphed me that it was necessary to use more tough and cellite. So we organized the supply of these materials from our Armenian and Transcarpathian deposits and ship them in by trains. Using such cellulite-containing materials was very beneficial, both when put into the soil for holding radionuclides and also when mixed into the bodies of dams that were being built on small and large rivers. I must say that, of course, there were many senseless things done in the course of this work. Not every work progress was documented, whether it had been completed or not. The commands were issued, however the checks on how precisely they had been fulfilled were at times delayed. For example, when I visited the site after some time, I found out that the sorbents had been simply poured around the storm sewer, when it would have been better to make a sort of a pallet that could be quickly replaced after the sorbents became saturated with radionuclides. Lev Alexeyevich Voronin, who was in charge of the government commission at the time, quickly understood me. He told me that he had issued correct orders, but I think those never got executed. Logistical issues started to arise, and a separation register was made. According to that register, all the materials that had been tested would be handed over to the army to use in decontamination tasks. On the other hand, the materials that needed testing were sent to the departments of the Ministry of Medium Machine Building. They were required to test the materials and create a report, and only after that they could be given to the army so they can be used on a larger scale. A lot of materials were used, but in the end, it all came down to the fact that the most effective measure was dust suppression, which in most contaminated areas meant just plain mechanical removal of the most contaminated debris. This mechanical removal was also done by robots that were acquired from, for example, the German Federal Republic. However, the use of robots was not successful because all the robots that were tested initially were either mechanically unable to operate among the wreckage, or they simply could not overcome the obstacles on large irregular surfaces. When on an even surface but inside strong radiation fields, their electronics, usually the control modules, failed, making them inoperable. There is a myth related in regards to the famous Joker robot, which was said that it became inoperable because our bureaucrats have lowered radiation requirements when ordering it. This is only a myth, because that robot was built in 1974 and was working in laboratories. Later, in 1982, it underwent modernization and was sent as is to Chernobyl in 1986. The reason it failed was because it had control circuits on its bottom, but the roof surface of the third block was covered with graphite particles which had melted, so most radiation was coming from underneath the machine, where it was most vulnerable. That's why, in the end, the most reliable method was to use radio-controlled bulldozers, or just simple scraper bulldozers, or ordinary vehicles, cabins, of which were reliably covered with lead to protect the driver. During the first stages, this was the most effective way, whereby using ordinary vehicles, but with proper crew protection, it became possible to collect and dispose of the most contaminated debris, the most dangerous contamination. The next operation was applying a special layer to the already cleared ground and cementing it. This operation was carried out. Powerful vacuum cleaners were used before the cementing. They cleaned up a lot of contaminated dust. Then came the chemical solutions. The most interesting ones were those proposed by Academy member Viktor Alexandrovich Kabanov, preliminarily tested in the dust storm-prone regions of Central Asia. These solutions were meant to bond the dust particles together, but at the same time let moisture through, thus allowing the subsoil to exist normally. All the solutions that we tested appeared to be successful. Kabanov, with the help of the heads of the Ministry of Chemical Industry, managed to organize production in Dzerzhinsk that was sufficient for our needs. These solutions were used extensively. The most trivial cleaning methods also had a big effect. Regular cleaning of roads, setting up points for decontamination of vehicles and people, all this became more and more organized and sophisticated as time passed. Earlier, I had started to talk about how the work in the Government Commission was organized. The work would start very early, at around 7 or 8 in the morning. The first meeting would be held. It was led by the chairman. Documentary conditions in the various parts of the district would be reported. Assignments would be issued, and the completed ones checked. After this, all the specialists would begin work on their assigned tasks. And in the late evening, at least when Sherbina was the chairman, around 10 in the evening, a summary was reported. Radiation conditions were evaluated. Work status of dam construction, well construction, about acquiring appropriate equipment and vehicles, about the construction of the sarcophagus. All this information was heard and operational decisions were made immediately. Regularly, several times a day, the leaders of the Government Commission spoke to comrades Vladimir Ivanovich and Nikolai Ryzhkov. All this was mandatory every day. After Ryzhkov and Ligachev arrived on the site, as I have already said, but I will repeat myself, the original Government Commission left. It was announced that it would be the permanent commission and it would be replaced by a stand-in. However, Sidorenko and I stayed behind to finish the decontamination work, while Sidorenko continued to investigate the role in what had happened and what was going on in the USSR State Committee on Supervision of Safe Conduct of Work in Atomic Energy. Late at night on the 4th of May, when the Government Commission was already being led by Ivan Stefanovich Silaev, a very calm man, I was called in by his order. It appeared that I had been summoned to Moscow to take part in the Politburo meeting that would take place on the 5th of May. I took the first available flight. After I arrived at the institute, they met me, washed me, and cleaned me as much as possible. Then I dropped by my home, saw my wife, who was of course very upset, and by 10 a.m. arrived at the Politburo, where in turns I reported to Sherbina and Comrade Ryzhkov about what was happening. The chairman of the Politburo, Mikhail Gorbachev, immediately warned me that at that moment he was not interested in the culpability and causality of the accident. He was interested in the current status of the work and the measures required from the government to resolve the situation faster. At the end of the meeting, Gorbachev requested Brezhnev and Chazov, who were at the meeting, to return to the site and continue the work. After the meeting, I went to the office of Boris Sherbina and asked whether this request was also addressed to me, or whether I should remain here in Moscow with the other Government Commission to continue my current work. He then replied, "Yes, you will stay here and continue your work." So I went to the institute, but before I reached my car, the phone rang and one of Sherbina's subordinates told me that as per a request by Silaev to the General Secretary, I needed to go back to Chernobyl because Velikov's unilateral actions were for some reason worrying Ivan Stefanovich. So on the same day, at 4 p.m., I flew out to Chikalovsk and once again arrived at Chernobyl, where I continued my work. The work went on as had been planned before, that is, in three aspects. One, monitoring the state of the fourth block, because the material drops had ended. Various probes had been put inside, thanks to which the temperature radiation fields, radionuclide movements could be measured. 2. Cleaning the area of the Chernobyl power plant itself. 3. The construction of the tunnel under the foundation of the fourth block and creating the perimeter of the 30-kilometer zone, continuing the dosimetric work and starting the decontamination tasks. At this time, both the Army and the regional organizations allocated builders for the construction of villages in which the evacuees could live. This was an enormous task that required moving masses of people, creating the necessary control systems, and quickly planning the logistics and work. Sometime around the 9th of May, it seemed to us that the fourth block had stopped living, breathing, and burning. It was calm on the outside, and we wanted to solemnly celebrate our Victory Day late in the evening on the 9th. But unfortunately, on that day, a small but very bright crimson spot was discovered inside the fourth block. This was evidence that the temperatures were still high there. It was difficult to determine if they were the parachutes burning that had been used to drop the lead and other materials. In my opinion, it was unlikely. Most likely it was a hot mass, as I understood it later, a mass of sand, clay, and all the other things that had been dropped. We were of course upset. The 9th of May celebrations were ruined, and we decided to drop another 40 tons of lead inside the crater. After that, the glowing stopped, and the 9th of May was celebrated on the 10th of May in a calm and a normal atmosphere. I cannot leave unmentioned the huge role that Marshal Aganov played along with his engineering troops. Every time there was a need to get from one place to another, or to lay a hose, it was necessary to punch holes. And each time we needed a hole, they did the calculations before using military engineering tools. This is shooting a gun of the appropriate caliber because there was a risk of the entire structure collapsing. It was imperative to make proper estimates and calculations. All this work was done by Marshal Aganov and his team with excellent precision and good organization. Even then, during those difficult days, despite everything, we were in good spirits, although it may seem paradoxically. It was of course not because we were taking part in liquidation of the consequences of such a tragic event. The tragedy, of course, was the primary background against which everything was going on. But what caused the good spirits was the way the people had been working, how quickly they responded to our requests, how quickly various engineering scenarios were evaluated. And we had already begun on the site to consider the first options for constructing a dome over the destroyed block. Later, that work was assigned to Comrade Batalin, the deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers. He took the leadership of the construction project in his hands, and subsequently the construction itself was assigned to the Ministry of Medium Machine Building. Around the 9th or 10th of May, Gorbachev, in a telephone call, asked me personally to give him some sort of chronology of the events, a description of what was happening, because he was preparing to speak on the Central Television to the entire Soviet Union. So I started preparing a note in which I described all that was known by that time, how the events had developed, how the destruction of the fourth block had happened, what work had already been done, and what work was yet to be performed. I handed this note to Velikov and Silayev. The first didn't add anything to the note, while the latter added a number of organizational notes. After that, all three of us signed that note and sent it to Gorbachev. I suppose what I'm saying is that the Institute, for the first time, managed to assemble a group of experts who looked at nuclear energy as a system, all elements of which should be equally efficient, equally safe and reliable, and depending on the size of one or the other in the system, the quality of the entire nuclear energy system should be more or less optimum.